All right, welcome. Hopefully your quiz went well. We'll be taking a look at it next class. But as we're kind of moving into this idea of, well, what happens if I want to solve for the angle? So what you're going to do is grab that trig table of yours and you're going to go into the sine column and you're going to search down it until you find in the sine column a value that is closest to 0.5. So take a moment, pause the video, and go find that. So hopefully when you're searching through that part of your table, hopefully you're seeing that, hey, it's a 30-degree angle. Now, we're going to take a little detour here, and I want to talk about how we write this. So let's think about the example. If you have 5x equals 3, how would you take and solve for x? Well, you would do so by dividing by 5. Now, this is one way of writing this. Another way you could write it is, and it's exactly the same, means the exact same thing, is you could multiply by 1/5. So think about that for a second. Pause the video if you need to look at it longer. But these are the same thing. Now, I can write the exact same thing in this other way. Now, right now, I'm looking for big picture understanding. You don't need to understand the details. You don't even need to necessarily be able to replicate it on your own. All you need to do is just understand the big picture here. You could also write this as 5 to the negative 1 times 5x equals 5 to the negative 1 times 3. All three of these are exactly the same statement. Now, the reason I mention this is because I want you to kind of start thinking about the fact that when you see a negative 1 power, it undoes something. That when we're looking at this, we're multiplying by 5 on the x. Well, to undo it, I'm going to multiply by 5 to the negative 1. When I see that negative 1 power, it is undoing the thing I was doing before. So now bring that over here with us. So when I see sine, well, how do I undo a sine function? Well, I do a sine to the negative 1 function. So we would write this as the sine of negative 1 of sine of x equals sine negative 1 of 0.5. Well, the opposite of something over here, how we had 5 divided by 5, how it cancels, well, same thing happens here. And we are left with that x equals the sine inverse of 0.5, which we already said equals 30. And this is how we write that answer. So I want you to pause the video. I want you to try number 2 on your own. And I want you to get an answer that looks like this. I want you to write the inverse function notation and the value. So pause the video, give that a shot, use that trig table, put it to good use. All right, so coming over here, looking at this, while I have cosine, the inverse of cosine is cosine inverse of 0.5, which equals 60. So looking at this, there should be kind of a little bit of understanding. The part that's really important is this. Can you find the angle value in the table? Great. That is the most important part. This part, to me, is really important because it is that higher level mathematical notation, which for some of you, maybe you're sitting there, you're like, that looks scary. That looks complicated. And that's partly true. So when we're thinking about this, this is what we call the arc-trig or inverse trig functions. So we would see something like cosine inverse of x, and we would read it that way. This would be cosine inverse of x, is how we would read that. Now, that's the newer way of talking about it. This is the movement in mathematics of, if we take and use words that they've seen other places, then they are going to be able to access the information better, which is a great idea. But in my opinion, it loses some of the beauty of the fact that mathematics, well, mathematicians are creative in a lot of ways. Naming things is not one of those ways. Because the old way of talking about this is calling it arc cosine of x. And the reason for that, and the reason I like that better and I will use it more, and hence why I call this the arc-trig stuff, is because of this. Think about for a second. Do you know what a cosine function actually does? I didn't think so. You know what the word inverse does? Inverse means do the opposite of. So this is a function that's doing the opposite of whatever a cosine function does. Well, that's not very helpful if you don't know what a cosine function does. But when we think about arc cosine, that's a little bit more specific because we know a cosine function, we know what it looks like. We know that we have the cosine of an angle equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Well, arc is telling us that we have some triangle and we are given two sides, A and H. We want to know the arc. What arc completes the ratio? So whenever we see that arc function, that's just saying, hey, what angle works? What angle makes this true? So I would say of the arc-trig functions, these look scary, but aren't. In the end, once you get used to them, once you get comfortable with them, they're not scary. Now, there's areas of mathematics where it looks scary, and it is scary. For me, one of those areas is called partial differential equations. For me, this is the area of mathematics that I like the least. It's really cool. You can do some really awesome things, like the fact that if you have a drum and you hit that drum at just the right spot, it'll make no noise mathematically. That's a really cool idea. Trying to solve for it is miserable because you write out statements that look like this. And you get things that just, they look terrifying. This looks ugly, and it is really cool, but this looks scary, and it is. So it's always nice to kind of keep that juxtaposition in our heads of, we have the stuff that we're doing right now that is kind of scary looking, but in reality, it gets simpler. And that's the cool thing about the location and your mathematics journey that you're at is the things you're doing, the more complex it looks actually, the simpler it is. So I want you to go ahead and try this one. Try number 3. And pause the video so you have a little bit more time. So we get that x is arctangent of 1. And notice, one of the reasons I want you writing it this way is if you're looking at your calculator, do you see this button somewhere? Do you see tangent inverse on your calculator? Well, yeah, and then you can end up getting that x is 45. But you can also get that from the table. And it shows us how. You can use the table or the calculator. Both work, both give the same answer. There's benefits to both. So, looking at the rest of this sheet, let's do number 4 together, and then I'm going to leave the rest to you. So, looking at this, we just need to set up the ratio. It's the same thing we were doing before. We are given the opposite and the adjacent. So, opposite and adjacent, that's tangent. So the tangent of x equals 13 over 8. Or x equals arctangent of 13 over 8. And at this point, you could either plug this into your calculator exactly like this, or you could take and use your trig table and do 13 divided by 8, which is 1.625. So in your table, you end up finding that you're between 58 and 59, because 58 is 1.600 and 59 is 1.664. Well, 25 is closer to 0, so we would call this 58. But looking at it, thinking about it, if we had this value, it would really be 58.392 degrees for that angle. So make sure, work through this assignment, get all of your other assignments finished, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5, and now 4.6 are all officially assigned, and 4.1 through 4.6 are all going to be due next class. So make sure you're working on this, get it finished. If you have any questions, please come in tomorrow during lunch so that we can get them wrapped up and get you to a point where you're feeling comfortable. Hope you're having a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.